very much for that. Really, really interesting. I'm just going to kick off with sort of a question about, as a tactic that's emerged, sort of driven by almost like a social impetus. So what was it about that was happening as the emergence of, for you, what was it that was happening within society that was driving the necessity to have this hack and leak tactic being developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one answer just connects to why something like WikiLeaks, in spite of it, it's all its problems and controversies, took off at some level. And I'll give a very precise example. Who here has watched Collateral Murder? It's a video of American soldiers gunning down 2 Reuters journalists who were killed. And Reuters actually had seen the video and felt that it was pretty obvious that they were not insurgents on the ground. And Reuters was really, really kind of pushing the American government to have some accountability over this issue, right? But the US government was like, you're not allowed to publish on this. There's a lot of ethical questions with these tactics. I'm not trying to say that they're okay in all instances, but in the face of an American press who was not willing to stand up to the government, Reuters had seen the video, they were doing FOIAs. The government was like, well, we'll release an image clip, but not the other one, right? That's when Chelsea Manning, decided to release these things. So I think part of the answer just has to do with the lack of a backbone in American journalism at the time. And if you look at the history, too, of American journalism, there's moments where it has more of a spine and less of a spine. And there was a moment then that I think it lacked that, and some of these interventions kind of were responding to that.
Fantastic. So we're also joined by 2 other guests. So if you want to ask a question, but introduce yourself first before you ask a question, that would be great. So who would like to ask the next question?
Go on, I'll go first. Johnny, hi, Johnny Burr. I'm from CGI, background in government. I'm interested if you can unpack a little bit more about what makes the hacker in the mind. Clearly, they're going to be very good technically, but what makes the hacker rather than and the hack and leak, rather than someone who says, well, I'm going to go into cybersecurity, or I'm going to do something else, because I think that then starts to get after the motivations.
Yeah.
And we can see then, and then I've got another question afterwards, but we'll do that first.
First of all, to answer that question, it also depends on the time period that you're looking at. So I'm going to answer for 2 different time periods. So back in the 90s, when a lot of these groups like TASO, ADM, the Hacker's Choice, were breaking into systems, there weren't academic programs in cybersecurity. There were hardly books in this topic. And really, I think many of them were truly motivated by intellectual curiosity. For sure, there's elements of secrecy and transgression, right, that are also compelling. And so in that era, they were motivated by, I would say, a combination of edification, being part of a kind of secret society. But because they were not malicious, many of them, and I'm talking about folks like Mudge or Chris Weissapal, who were part of the Loft, and they testified on Congress about the state of security. And in the 90s, they were sort of saying, you know what, Microsoft, you're claiming you have good security, and you don't. And they were very adversarial, but their motivations were really about security, and many of them are CEOs and kind of leaders in both government and the corporate sphere, right? And anyways, I've written 40,000 words, like half a book on this topic about how that came to be, because a lot of people were like, why would you trust, you'd never trust an arsonist to be a firefighter, right? This was Gene Spafford from Purdue was saying this, Dorothy Denning, who actually did research on the topic, unlike Spafford, sorry. She interviewed the hackers and she's like, you know what, they actually seem to want to do good, right? So in that era, that. Criminal hackers, I mean, I understand that hacktivism can be technically criminal, but I still want to differentiate it from like the business-oriented stuff, which I have less experience with. With the hacktivism, I mean, I think also there was something about the zeitgeist at the time where, you know, that was the period where you had the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and a lot of the people who'd gotten involved in Anonymous actually came from here, the UK and Ireland, like Mustafa Al-Bassam, who's currently like a CEO of a crypto company. And I think there was a sort of motivation, a kind of motivation of like wanting to do good and have fun, and they were young, right? And I think the approach in the UK is a little bit better than the United States, where you get arrested, you get in trouble, maybe you spend, you know, 3 months in jail, 6 months, and then you're free to go. In the United States, what happens is that, you know, the hammer comes down really hard, and then it does kind of create a blowback of like, you know, why would I ever work for the government, right? So that's a little bit, but these are really good questions, right? Like what leads people to do this? But again, the anonymous era was really weird. Like there was all these twists and turns that were so contingent and so accidental that it's almost hard to be like they were motivated by anything, but were just sort of experimenting and going with the flow at the time.
Thank you. So, Adele.
I just wanted to build on that sort of psychology point.
Who are you?
Who am I? Adele Every, here from Cisco. So I look after public sector in the UK. I'm fascinated by the sort of psychology of it and how people get into this. And sort of aside from state-sponsored hacktivists, how do these organisations recruit for like-minded individuals on topics that they're passionate about?
That's a great question.
Tesco's?
LinkedIn.
So Anonymous was a global decentralized movement. It's actually what academics called a multiple use name. There's actually a very famous multiple use name from the UK called Captain Swing. The Luddites, for example, would destroy machinery, and the actions would be credited by Captain Ludd. Anyone could be Captain Ludd. Do you see what I'm saying? So anyone could be anonymous. And because it was a multiple use name that was anonymous and faceless, it like really did spread like wildfire, and it actually attracted very different types of people at 2 levels. First of all, a lot of people were not hackers. They were just like doing propaganda, videos, posters, right? And you had really people from all walks of life. Hackers, all male, not a surprise. I don't think those people would normally associate if they were not anonymous. Because you had everything. I'll just give you a brief description of some of the people involved in LulzSec. You had everything from Jeremy Hammond, who's like a hardcore leftist, anti-capitalist, to people who are just kind of having fun, to people who were sort of, I would say, like liberal labor Democrats, to people who didn't have jobs, to people, I'll give one of my favorite examples was there was a young lad from Ireland called Donica O'Carroll. And Donica disappeared for like a month. And he was actually not into the humor or having fun. Like he was really politically motivated. His father had been part of the IRA. And he got arrested, and I went to his trial, and I was like, Donica, where were you that month? He's like, I had finals at Trinity, and they were really, really hard, and I wanted to ace them. And that's where he was. So the types of people, and this has to do with anonymity. Anonymity gets in the way of what's called like homophily, where like-minded people attract each other. But when you don't have markers of, you know, class, ethnicity, identity, you do create the conditions for difference. But I think that's a little bit unique to Anonymous. And just about your recruitment point, Anonymous did recruit because they had videos, they were all over the place, they had the Nyan Cat, like they were really, really good at sort of making their presence known. Phineas Fisher, for example, which is either an individual or a group, they go by they, those are their pronouns. They only strike intermittently, because I think it's a very small operation where they don't recruit. Does that make sense? Because they've decided, security is always a trade-off. Like, presence means that there's a limelight on them, and yes, it would probably engender more Phineas Fishers, but they like disappear and then just strike and don't recruit. And so I think this is a more common thing we'll see in the future, is more surgical and intermittent forms of hacks and leaks from hacktivists. Nation states, I think, are a different, entity that I truly don't know as much about.
I mean, it's interesting, the recruitment, because I remember the free ion cannon, where they had these hacking groups like tapped into the SETI at home, like allow your computer to be rented free to kind of solve, protein folding or search for extraterrestrial life. And they went, well, we can do this. Let's use your computer and we'll use it as part of our
DDoS.
DDoS, right? And
Right.
people were signing up and downloading and doing it
Yeah.
because it was, non-technical people, because they believed they were doing it for a good cause.
Right.
But that's not my question.
Yeah.
Given what's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks, I'm
remind
interested
me.
to kind of get your thoughts on how the current political landscape, building on my previous question, might drive adaptation of the current hack and leak kind of technique or tactic, if you like. So, lots of political turmoil globally. What do you, crystal ball, what do you think we're going to see next?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I think, I was in the interview earlier talking about the known unknown and the unknown unknown. That's Donald Rumsfeld's phrase, right? And I think, in cybersecurity, there's the known unknown and then the unknown unknown. I think the hack and leak is a good example of the unknown unknown. Like, it really sprung up in a way that was very surprising, became kind of naturalized very early. I do think for the, as I had sort of pointed out, I think nation states will get better at kind of covering their tracks so that we will have to rely on forensic evidence. And I think shadow brokers, which released a lot of the CIA tools, is a really good example. It's sort of like they were really, really purposeful about the language they chose. They're still kind of an enigma. And so I expect to see that a little bit more. I think something else that already has happened is there's another group called Guacamaya, which is a reference to a type of bird in Latin America. They're also very colorful. They have really good aesthetics and music. And they've hacked the Mexican military. The emails were reported by the New York Times. They hacked a Bolivian mining company and the Chilean military. Not been caught. Some theories that it's maybe Phineas Fisher reinvented. I'm not surprised that they're not targeting U.S. companies and entities, because the U.S. has like the cyber might to go after people, whereas Latin America does not, right? And so I also think that might continue for a while as well. I think one last comment, Trump emails were hacked by the Iranians supposedly and sent to a couple of journalistic outfits. Because of these reports, people felt like they were not newsworthy and did not release them. So that was interesting to see a kind of type of restraint. There were some journalists who felt like they should have been, but they tended to be journalists who were super, 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 super anti-Trump, right? So that's not surprising as well. So I know that's not satisfying at some level, but I do think this tactic will continue in ways that will be a little bit more potentially elusive than they have been in the last 10 years, where you really could identify who did what at some level.
Great. Johnny, you said you had another question.
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, some of the groups you said, and the ones that we recognise, or most people on the street would recognise, Anonymous, had big visual presence.
Right.
And you made the point about them being, kind of how they advertise themselves almost, because it's part of it is the fun of it.
Right.
But I also wondered whether there was something about the ethical kind of aspects to it. So are the groups, and have they got certain ethical characteristics and things that they won't do versus what they will do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the case of Anonymous, there was a shift over time where I think some people initially got involved because it was fun, or maybe had an incipient sense of politics, right? And I'll give also a good example. Mustafa Al-Bassam, who got a PhD in cryptography at King's College. He's the CEO of a crypto company, a sort of upstanding citizen. He was 16 at the time that he joined Anonymous, and he was actually a Muslim immigrant. I knew T-Flow, that was his nickname, was from the UK, and I imagine a rich kid stuck at boarding school. I was completely wrong. And he explained that when a company, and I can't remember the name of the company, but a company DDoSed the pirate bay, and there was no retribution against the company, he's like, screw it, double standard. I'm going hard in Operation Payback. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so there is a way in which some of the people involved had a sort of coming of age and sort of were politicized through Anonymous. And then just 2 additional points. It may be hard to believe because Anonymous was at some level chaotic, but there were norms that kind of guided the people involved. So one was not to seek sort of fame for your actions, and this was really important for the non-hackers because they could actually do that. They weren't breaking the law, and when people tried to do that, there was this sort of threat, no, we have to do this for the group. And then LulzSec broke away because by the time that happened, Anonymous had become synonymous with social movements, and LulzSec sort of just wanted to have fun. So there had been a strong kind of political orientation, right? Of course, then when Jeremy Hammond joins, he's much more of a leftist and then moves things towards a much more like direct action orientation. So there are these sort of limits in political orientations, but it shifted a lot in the period of time under which I studied them. Guacamaya, for example, is like environmentalists. We're exposing environmental harms. They went after the Mexican military partly because things like the 43 students who are disappeared, right? They're very political and targeted, are not just going to go after entities for the fun of it. So it's a little bit of a spectrum, and it depends, but that's also why it's important to have researchers on the ground, because I think if you don't really understand what's going on, it's very easy to kind of paint a picture that doesn't accord with reality.
So just now that I guess you've got another question coming in, I'm just going to come out to the audience and say it's time to get your thinking caps on because coming to you to ask some questions, so get the little grey cells working and be ready. Adele, do you have another question?
Well, I was just sort of picking up on that point around, you sort of tar everybody with a similar brush in this domain, and it kind of looks and feels quite negative, but you've just touched on something there around climate activists, and we see a lot of controversial things that climate activists do in this country, but do you think there's an opportunity for hack and leak for good? And what does that look like? And
yeah, I mean, I did in this presentation really try, I know there's very different types of people in the audience, and I think it's really important to just understand the history on its own terms. And I try to disassociate that from my own personal views, but now I'm going to give my own personal views, which is I do think that there are moments it can be helpful. And what I think is interesting about the tactic is that it is high risk. And you do, even though it is, people are trying to evade the law, so it's not in the kind of style of, Martin Luther King, which is like, I'm going to break the law in person. You see me, there are risks. Mm-hmm. And I was like, if you're going to take the risk and risk going to jail, as many have, and you're going to find information that is in the public interest, I do support it. I also think that just like, for example, Anonymous was like super experimental, WikiLeaks was super experimental and kind of blew up, and new organizations are doing a much better job at handling these leaks responsibly. And just maybe for a quick example, so there's a hacktivist group called XNet in Spain. And it's run by like programmers and a brilliant woman called Simona Levy, who used to be in theater. And she was very much inspired by the hacks and leaks and WikiLeaks, but was like, yeah, I can improve upon this. So she first of all called the Spanish public, send us leaks about corruption and so on and so forth. So people, I don't know who, it probably was not from a hack, well, who knows. She got a corpus of emails related to some banking professionals and banks who had engaged in sort of massive, but massive corruption. And what she did was she did not release the emails. What she did was, first of all, she sent them to 15 journalists. She then redacted so much material to not implicate, the regular worker. Then she also knew that information doesn't necessarily just lead to action. So she, first of all, did a crowdfunding campaign to sue the bankers, which was successful. They ended up going to jail. And she wrote a play based on the emails and enrolled very famous Spanish actors in Barcelona and in Madrid to put on the play, which helped kind of motivate the campaign. And again, I think at least she did it responsibly. You shouldn't just dump these emails out there. But you might be accused of editorializing, which is why you need to send the full corpus to a trusted party. So yes, I do think that there are instances where this can serve the public interest. I realize as people tasked with security, it's probably not, the thing that is foremost on people's mind, but that's, I guess, my opinion.
Thank you very much. Right, if somebody could just pass me the roving mic, that's just over there by the apple, so I don't have to go too far over there. Does anybody have? Thank you very much, sir. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, good. A first taker, fantastic. Thank you very much. The microphone is on. You just have to hold it very close to your mouth.
Thank you very much. My name's Ian Hargreaves. I'm the chair of the British Army Cyber Association. Gabriella, I think you said that you wouldn't trust an arsonist to be a firefighter.
Oh, I didn't say that. Gene Spafford did. Okay.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
I'll improve my notes later. In my experience, the best cyber defenders have an attacking mindset. How can those two views coexist?
So that's a great question, and that's why I think, again, this was a debate happening in the early 90s. Gene Spafford is at Purdue University, one of the few early computer scientists who were working on cybersecurity, and he very publicly was like, you can't hire, again, what I really do think were mostly, not entirely, non-malicious black hat hackers exploring systems, and Dorothy Denning, who had also been at Purdue and then did cybersecurity at DEC, interviewed these hackers and was like, no, you have to kind of judge them individually. Many of them have this attacker mindset, right? And so I think that there's all sorts of ways that that is happening today with things like capture the flag contests, that happen at DEF CON, or there's a really big one, NorthSec in Montreal, that I used to go to a lot, right? And I also think that you need to create spaces that are, group-oriented and fun for people to learn these skills. So that's one thing. I think another thing is, it's still, while the threats against security researchers for releasing a vulnerability are not as strong as they used to be, that's still kind of dangling there a little bit, and there's some sort of tension or animosity between groups. And I do think that that the practice of releasing these vulnerabilities is not necessarily a bad thing if it's done with good intentions, right? And again, I think the US is particularly bad compared to kind of other nations around this, but you have to kind of let people expose these vulnerabilities without the threat of legal action as well. So that's possibly one way. But a quick story. So who here knows Charlie Miller? Okay, he used to be at the NSA. He was a mathematician. He got hired to do offensive hacking for the NSA. And he was like, I don't know how to do this. And so he read FRAC, which is like a really, really, really important, was and still is an important journal of the underground, right? And he was just like, this is how he kind of learned about what he needed to do in order to do that. I think that's changed a lot today, but it does give you a window into what it was like in parts of the 80s and 90s when this expertise was not as common.
Thank you very much. Who's next? Yes, fantastic.
You mentioned earlier, sorry, I'm Paul Welshaw from Zally, and you
What's
mentioned
Zelly?
Zally, we do AI cybersecurity, so
Okay.
we use AI and machine learning
Right.
to combat AI.
Right.
so,
That's,
yeah. So we're a bit like the arsonist trying to firefight. So it's good. So my question is all around AI, and you talked earlier about the fog and it's getting denser in hacking and hacktivism. How can we know what's real and what's not real anymore with like the quality of AI coming out there? And like how does the hacking community deal with that? And is it being used? So
yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I'm less equipped to talk about, you know, the rise of new forensic methods that will need to be used under these conditions, but they'll obviously have to evolve. And I do still think that there is, again, a place for trying to get researchers, embedded in different communities, or, you know, use the data that gets leaked. For example, there's a forthcoming book by Max Smeets, who's a kind of researcher that is publishing a book on ransomware groups from a very sociological perspective, and he used the Conti leaks in order to do that, right? So invest in sociologists and anthropologists. I think that is worthwhile. You know, in terms of AI, I think it's still a little bit early to tell how this is going to play out. Obviously, it's already being used by cyber criminals, but it's also being used for defensive purposes, right? And so recently I interviewed Chris Weissapal, who had been part of this group called The Loft, who professionalized, and he founded a company called Veracode, which does auditing, and they use AI. But they have to use AI smartly too. AI, you know, really introduces a lot of mistakes. And so if you don't have like the human eyes on it, he basically is arguing that we will see a degradation of auditing tools unless it's human and machine centered. And I also really believe that as well. So a little bit of that, but probably things will really, really surprise us as AI unfolds into the future.
So before we go to the next question, just wonder if Adele or Johnny, you have anything you wanted to ask and follow up on those questions or those answers? Put you on the spotlight. The answer no is also fine.
No, yeah.
So I was just going to say, I mean, just going back to the the firefighter and arsonist, coming from somebody who's just spent 5 years developing and delivering our MSc in cybersecurity program, you know, I always get questions around should we be teaching penetration testing to students, and in some ways the answer is no, we shouldn't be teaching them how to be criminals, but equally largely we're teaching them stuff that's a little bit more advanced than perhaps what they can just find in these forums, but we're doing it in a way that gives them also an ethical framework and a safe place to explore so that they can become better defenders. And I think that's really where we need to get to, because if we need to have, or we have to have professional security people in our organisations defending them, they need to know how the bad entities are going to come after them. Right? If they don't have that knowledge, then we're tying their hands behind their back, I think.
No, and you know, I do encourage folks to go to like a hacker security conference, like DEF CON in the States, and I'm sure there are ones here. I mean, I do think there is a kind of normative framework to push the boundaries, but not, for example, tamper with the emergency phone system, right? And I think it's better to be in those communities where there's a sense of fellowship, camaraderie, ethical norms, right? And it's funny too, because in my history of professionalization, at a certain point, Microsoft did start hiring some of these hackers. So they hired Window Snyder, was a woman who was, again, I don't think, doing like hugely illegal things, but probably some illegal things. And she professionalized, and she goes to Microsoft. This is in the late 90s. And she's like, you know what? You guys are scared of hackers. Go to DEF CON. Go to DEF CON and Black Hat. And so her manager is like super scared. He's like, oh my God, what's gonna happen there? And then he's like, ah, that was so great. You know, it's like an intellectual conference with a little bit more sort of rowdiness and drinking, you know? And so I think just interfacing with the non-criminal but independent hacker community is a good way to understand how they kind of work. And I think that's a good domain to kind of nurture, because it does create people who are willing to push the boundaries, but not in a way that will cause harm. And most of those people are working in the industry today.
Just one following up on that. Going back to that mindset thing, it's actually about getting, if you're trying to make something as secure as possible, then you want people from a different mindset who will not accept how it's put together, but will want to take it apart, see if it comes, you know, kind of get it back together again. It's a mindset thing, isn't it?
It is a mindset
And it's about
thing.
having that kind
Yeah.
of different mindset in terms of how you know, how you think about things, and having that diversity of approach, I think, to help, but absolutely with an ethical kind of boundaries.
Yeah. And the mindset gets cultivated in a community sense, and it emerges, for example, in my first book, I was really struck about how hackers across, so I study different types of hackers. Like open source are really nerdy, and they're like, I'm gonna stay within the bounds of the law and release free software. Like, they're not breaking the law, right? The underground is like, I'm gonna break in, and you know, they're much more edgy. They're very different, but they're both parts of the hacker community. What unites them? I theorize they're united by a commitment to the craft ethic, to do a good job, and what I call craftiness, a willingness to push the boundaries. And so, for example, in the world of free software, there is a type of craftiness there, because, you know, Richard Stallman, who had kind of founded this idea, was like, I don't like copyrights and patents. So what did he do? He literally hacked the law. He reinvented the law. He's like, I'm going to use copyright, but disable its logic. And now those licenses, the copyleft licenses, are used. My books are under copyleft licenses. That's a crafty move. You see what I'm saying? It's like, I'm not going to accept the given, but I'm going to work within the given and turn its logic upside down. And that's what unites different hacker communities. And while it's a personal mindset, it's cultivated collectively. And it's often cultivated by things like this. So when I started doing field work among hackers, I was like, oh my God, not only do they tell jokes when giving a talk, like, which is common, people will interrupt you to give a joke. Like, you might be giving a talk, like I could have been giving a talk and a hacker in the audience. If there was a moment to tell a joke, they'll tell a joke. That's very uncomfortable to do, but they're willing to defy decorum and also show their cleverness at that moment. So I kind of theorize hacker humor in terms of craft and craftiness as well, for those who are interested.
There's obviously no hackers here then today.
I don't know, he is.
Yeah.
He is. I can tell he was just
the
like
British
shining.
politeness, I think, British politeness. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, that sounds great. Get my steps in.
So, thanks for the excellent presentation. In my previous life, I did a lot of work in offensive security for an agent, for a government, actually, for a private company. So, yeah,
Keep it ambiguous.
But anyway, so one of the things that we came across was during the Ukraine war. We found out that Anonymous was actually using some tools when the Conti group broke up. Now, that really threw me off, because I was like, well, Conti being pro-Russian,
Right.
and why would Anonymous actually take some of their tool sets and actually use them against Russia? So I was just wondering if you maybe reflect on that.
Yeah, I don't know about the particular case, but I love that example. And part of what I want to say is, like, we don't know, right? And that's why it's so important to know. You know, this is a while ago, and a very different example, but I think a good one, around Al-Qaeda, where, you know, in the media they were sort of described as like loose and decentralized and shadowy, but they were actually very well organized, had a kind of structure of bureaucracy, right? They were very careful about, like, the technology they used. And so I can't say what happened in that case, and I'm a little bit reluctant to say anything, but that's why we need to sort of be on the ground. And again, back to the anonymous example, I mean, some journalists tended to write about Anonymous in ways that, again, really did not accord with the reality of things. And so they'd be like, really, there's two major movers and shakers. And there were big, important personalities. Sabu, Topiary, who's from Scotland, was a really good propagandist. But like a lot of hacker projects, they worked as a group, if that makes sense, right? It wasn't like these leaders calling the shots, and that was what was being described. So I know I didn't answer your question, but I think those are the types of questions we need to be asking and actually answering with empirical data.
I just want to come in and say, there is a really interesting trend, speaking from sort of my own personal experience, of this idea of living off the land. And so, why reinvent something if it's already there? Like, and I think there is a part intrinsic efficiency
Of reuse.
Of reuse,
Right.
And so, hence the reason why we've got a plastic box to make sure,
Right.
classic hacker culture. Like, what have we got? How do we make it work? And that's good enough.
Right.
And that's born from like a lot of coding competitions as well. It's like how the smallest amount of bytecode used to be able to create a malicious piece of code, or using old hardware and getting it, really pushing it to the ultimate limits of what it can do. And people with Amiga 500s and Commodore 64s doing ridiculously complex things they were never designed to do. And it's all in that spirit, I think, of reuse, mend, like how can we adapt, live off the land. And there was a big, about 5 years ago, there was a really big push as a cultural sort of penetration testing kind of move that was, we're not going to use specialist tools, right? How do we get into systems only using the tools that are available on those systems?
Right.
So we're leaving limited footprints. And so I think it's part of that type of conversation.
And there is a lot of sort of status seeking in this community where it's like, I get to show you how brilliant I am. I can't remember that Oscar Wilde quote, but there's something like, I have nothing to show but my genius or something. And like a lot of hackers, that's what they're trying to do with peers. They both like really help each other, but also want to outperform each other. So it's a very competitive and collaborative culture at the same time.
Anybody else? Yes, Frank.
Frank Rainford. I'm from the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So
Interesting.
we decommission all the old nuclear sites around the UK. So people talk to me a lot about AI, penetration testing, software packages. How much do you think we don't take account of the genres and psychology of the past? Because I believe this is a human factors risk, not a technology risk. So do we take enough account of that rather than focusing on how we can stop it with AI, penetration testing and software?
No, that's a great question because, we're often working with the paradigms of the present. And, one of the most important books of the 20th century was by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he basically challenged the philosophy of science, which had a very idealized account of how science proceeds, where it's like, you're working in your lab, you get some new data, and you re-theorize. And he's like, you know what? It doesn't happen that way. What happens is we get stuck with our paradigms, and it's only when there's like a pile of contrary evidence do we then shift our paradigms, right? And I do think that's part of our, a big part of our biases, right? And it is really hard to kind of shift, not only because you don't know what's going to happen, which is really, really hard to deal with, but then you get stuck with the paradigms of the past, right? And so, one book I really, 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 really like on this topic is called Red Teaming by Micah Zenko, who's a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and he actually hung out a lot with offensive hackers. And he said, what can we learn about red teaming and how to apply it to your organization? Because organizations are often very conservative in a way that don't deal well with internal critique, right? Because oftentimes internal critique is showing like dirty laundry, and people don't like to hear that. I've experienced it myself too. And so he then has some good methods that people can use in different institutions, nonprofits, corporations, universities, to take the principles of red teaming in order to kind of probe your resistance to change. So it's not what I'm answering is not like a particular piece of content, but a method by which to be open to kind of new paradigms. And it's a great book, Red Teaming by Micah Zenko.
Any other questions? Sorry. Yes.
I'm Lydia. I'm from Plexo. My question was around the mis and disinformation angle. And misinformation has been around for decades, but only the last maybe 5-10 years it's really started to gain traction.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you thought that the rise of disinformation has impacted the kind of potency of hack and leak, because there's already the erosion of public trust, people and maybe doubting things which are actually true, which have been hacked and leaked. I wondered if your thoughts on that.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think in some ways, it depends on the content in the hack and leak. I think in some instances, let's just say there's a public interest hack and leak of some really horrible crime. It's harder to have force in the world today, at least in the United States, because really there is such mistrust of establishment media currently, that if you, let's just say, have some valuable information, it won't necessarily have any impact. On the other hand, I think it is easier then to take, let's just say, the hack and leak used for the purposes of sowing, mistrust, and use that effectively. I think, for example, a good strategy, I don't know if you guys remembered, but Macron in 2017, was running, and there was leaks right before the election, and there's a media blackout a couple of days before the election, which helped prevent those leaks from having an impact, right? Now that's a hard thing, because I actually, back to the disinformation thing, there's a lot of disinformation on X right now, including by its owner, I would say. But I actually don't think that the way to deal with misinformation is censoring, actually. I think it's very counterproductive for two reasons. One is something that might seem like disinformation or misinformation might indeed be true. These things are not always kind of clear-cut. And the second thing, it creates resentment, which is what we see in the United States. But I think the blackout's an interesting thing, because it's sort of like, well, for a couple days, and then you can report on it, right? So it's not like this blanket ban, but this sort of temporary switch. So that might be like, a middle point. But I do think the problem of disinformation is very difficult, and while social media also accentuates it, I think there's other things going on in the ground as well that are driving it too.
So if there's one, see if there's one last question, but then priming the rest of the panel for some final questions or thoughts. Has anybody else got one more question from the audience? Yes.
Hi, my name's Darren from Info Group. My question is around the organisational structure of a community like Anonymous. Does it exist? Is there like a CEO and then a head of function? What I'm trying to understand is they're very sophisticated setups, and it doesn't just happen by the scattergun approach. So from that aspect, do you have, we mentioned earlier the fact that it's marketed very well. So there'll be a marketing executive. People like that will exist within these organisations, or is that just not the case?
Great question. So there's absolutely specialization, but it's a lot of hacker groups, whether it's something like Anonymous, or, for example, I'm very familiar with the Tor project. I imagine people here know what the Tor project is. It allows you to be anonymous online. I used to be on the board. These communities run by consensus often, where you kind of hammer things out collectively, but there's specialization, right? So, for example, with Anonymous, there was someone called Topiary, who was Jake, what's his last name? He was Scottish, and he was brilliant with writing. He wasn't a hacker, right? And so he was in charge of the content, and I'll give you one of my favorite examples. So Anonymous, LulzSec were upset at a documentary film made about Chelsea Manning that they felt was too sensationalist. So they hacked PBS who made the documentary, and they just defaced their front page website. And they implanted a story, and this gets to the disinformation question, because I think it's very different from disinformation. They planted a story, which is that Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls had been found in New Zealand hiding away from celebrity culture. They were alive. Like, everyone knew that was not real, and it was written very well. I mean, it's hilarious. And so you knew immediately it was kind of fake. He wrote the writing, someone did the intrusion, right? And in hacker circles, for example, with something like hacking and leaking, there's someone who does the hacking. For example, someone else might be in charge of how do you download all that information so that you're not detected, right? And so there is definitely a division of labor, but it's done in a pretty horizontal manner. I often kind of compare it to academic departments. Like, the chair of a department has no power. They just have terrible work. I never want to be chair. Because it is consensus-based, right? So it kind of operates that way. And if you want, I watch a lot of films that have like hacking scenes or hackers. And one that I really, really like is called Who Am I? No System is Safe. And it's German. It was like, Hollywood type production. And what it does is that it represents 4 types of hackers: the hardware hacker, the programmer, the exploit writer, and the social engineer. And they're all working together in a collective way to make things happen. And that's one of the reasons why I like the movie, is that they represent that teamwork that is, I think, really common to hacking, as opposed to just the individual doing things. Although an individual can also just do things as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, my partner hates us watching movies, because every time there's a hacking scene, I'm just like, that is not how computers work. Like, that's just not how it's supposed to be. So, come back to the panel. Adele, you were going to ask something.
I was.
Go on,
I was
you're
going
ready.
like that,
Go,
wasn't I?
go.
I was leaning in. I just wanted to pick up on that, because I wonder whether there's been any examples of hackers who there are these organisations that exist and communities, but are there collaborations, perhaps partly state-sponsored? So do states ask Anonymous to do work for them, and how does that work? Are there
That's such a good question.
ecosystems?
I feel like I cannot give a lecture about this. So I'm going to give just 2 examples. One is pretty historical. I think nation states have a lot more, technical capacity than they used to. But one of my projects, which is a really tough nut to crack, is the French state in the late 1990s did not have great offensive hacking capabilities. So one intelligence organization retrained its cryptographers, and another organization basically was like, we're going to infiltrate the underground. And those young lads, not the term they use in France, who were arrested, will go to them and say, jail? Or do you want to help to teach us how to hack? And so that happened. It's been written about a little bit more from the perspective of those who enrolled the hackers, but I'm trying to interview the young men who were either, they were press ganged to kind of do this. So there's those examples. I know in the case of sort of the Russian government, my understanding is that some of the groups operate somewhat independently, but Russia gives them cover, right? And they're a little bit like the privateers of yore, who might be working on the behalf of the British Navy until, for example, the British Navy didn't need them, right? But there was a period of time where, pirate privateers were kind of working for themselves and governments. And I do think you see that a little bit as well in this world. So, but great question.
Johnny, did you have anything?
Yeah, mine was sort of slightly more personal in terms of, not that sort of personal, but is it one got sort of, how did you get into this, was the first question. And then you obviously got an interest, you'll tell us that. But the second question is then, you've probably met quite a few of these people.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just kind of interested in sort of what they're like, and whether they're sort of, come in, we'd love to tell you about the stuff we do, or whether it's a bit more standoffish, but anyway.
Yeah. So how did I get into this? I mean, I'm going to answer very quickly for two things. I mean, I went to graduate school in the late 90s, and I was a very traditional medical anthropologist that studied religious healing in Guyana, South America, a former British colony. I'm from Puerto Rico. But I had been interested in the copyleft. I was like, how is it that these engineers, these hackers came up with these new legal tools that people started to use? So I kind of followed it on the side. And then I ended up getting really sick for a year, and so I was stuck at home on the internet. And so I just spent all my time on the internet following the free software movement, which was really exploding. And by the time I got better, I was like, well, this is what I want to do, which I think connects to the second question. I'll maybe briefly talk about how I got to Anonymous, which is very different. I did like their sort of humor, tricksterism. I found it to be a very, this is the open source community. They're just like, you want to hear about Linux? I'll tell you about Linux for 10 hours. They were like super welcoming, right? They, even though they're definitely not 100% of a diverse community, they tended to also just be very kind of open to outsiders who were interested in them, right? Anonymous, I got to by the weirdest way. In the 90s, there was a Usenet group. Usenet was a very popular mailing list that was very critical of the Church of Scientology. And the Church of Scientology would go after a lot of the critics, some of whom were geeks and hackers. And geeks and hackers were really like, Scientology is like the perfect nemesis to the hacker world, because Scientology is like fake science and technology, and hackers are like into science and technology. Scientology thinks that science fiction is real. Hackers love science fiction, but no, it's science fiction. So they're kind of attracted to this world. And so I was doing a historical project on some of the battles between Scientology and this Usenet community. But I was secretive because Scientology really went after its critics. I was uber secretive about it. And then when Anonymous came into being to troll target the Church of Scientology, it's like, oh, that's super interesting. Here's a new round of geeks and hackers going after the church. So I just went down that rabbit hole, if that makes sense. So it's very, very accidental. And just very briefly, like the community that are now security professionals, I think it would have been really hard to research them like 10, 15 years ago, because they'd be more reluctant to talk about their exploits of the 80s and 90s, but because statute of limitations have run out, because they're all like CEOs with lots of money, they're like happy to talk about it. And I'm currently working with them on a huge hacker archive project as well, where they're documenting their history and culture. So there's a lot of personal relations. I do tend to find it a very kind of interesting and welcoming community as well. I think it certainly helps that I'm a female as well, because they don't necessarily expect the type of technical expertise that they might expect of a male as well.
Thank you very much. So we're just going to, after this, we're just going to put Gabriella away, do a bit of filming, and then she'll come back and join everybody for some drinks and canapes. But one of the things, I know some of you have been here before, one of the things that everybody's going to get is one of our challenge coins for Beyond Cyber. So
thanks.
Gabriella, there's yours.
Hackers love these too.
And, just let's give Gabriella a round of applause and thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. Hopefully that's been really interesting. And the idea is now stay around, build your networks, have a chat with some other interesting people in the room. Obviously have a chat with Gabriella when we come back. But drinks and canapes should be around somewhere. The team from Lancaster is going to come around and give everybody their challenge coins. I hear they're going for a pretty penny on eBay these days. You wait till Series 2 challenge coins come out, they'll go up in price. But thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.